working our way on to chapter 2. And here we have Luke providing an orderly account. Sorry, the count's not with us today. An orderly account of the birth and boyhood of Jesus. Now in this chapter, we have another orderly account of what Luke received from Mary. In all likelihood, a lot of this account came from Mary. An account that as a mother, she would recount very strongly and retell very often. And as you quizzers know, there is very little memory loss that way. So Mary would have remembered it very well. So, when this chapter repeatedly says that Mary treasured these things and pondered them in her heart, you can bet she didn't just hide those little gems in her heart. As you might see from verse 19 and 51, she pondered these things. And you can bet Mary didn't hide her little light under a bowl either, as we see Jesus jabbing others for doing in a little later on in Luke 11. And certainly, we don't see Joseph, her hiding this little light from Joseph or Elizabeth either. And nor did a lot of those other people hide that light under the bowl. Simeon and Anna, they would have outed that light repeatedly. And I expect that the first miracle at that wedding at Cana wasn't the first time that Mary outed Jesus either. And not only that, but I doubt that those shepherds hid that light either. Those shepherds that heard that very evangelistic and Calvinistic message from those excited angels. Those shepherds who heard that a path of peace is now available. Whoa! But as our NIV suggests, our NIV is very good this time, better than the old King James. Our NIV suggests that they heard that the path of peace would be only for those that God would have favor on. That peace would only be for those who would leave their sheep for him. And that's a Calvinist doctrine. John Calvin sort of made that one popular. That only this atonement was only limited to certain people. And he didn't establish that doctrine from this particular text because he did not have this translation. He had an older translation. And he had older manuscripts. He had a manuscript with a Greek word without the S, without the sigma. And makes a big difference, makes a world of difference. So that not everybody will find peace on earth, but only a select few. Unlike this Christmas card that you often see. Well, maybe you don't see Christmas cards anymore, but this was a recent Christmas card. This picture you see here is a recent Christmas card, and it says, "Glory to God in the highest, on earth, peace, goodwill toward men," which is the King James translation. However, this goodwill would not be towards all men. All men will not rest in peace. Only a select few will rest in peace. And will they rest at all? But let's have a look at some other coming outs. Not just the coming out of the shepherds and whatnot, but let's look at Jesus coming out of the womb, his coming out to Jerusalem as a teen, and his coming out of boyhood. So, now we get to play with some dates. Oh boy, dates. Mathematics. Here we go. We're going to play with some dates now. So, firstly, the census. You read about the census, they were called out to Bethlehem because of a census. That census of verse 2 is very contentious. It's contentious because the date of the great census, 7 years AD, it doesn't correspond with the dating we have for the birth of Jesus, which is 5 or 6 BC. There's a dozen years difference here. Something's wrong. We're talking about a census. Something's wrong. And it doesn't correspond with Quirinius being governor at that time. But wait. We do have an ancient Latin manuscript called the Tiburtine inscription, which I read about recently in the Cretan magazine. And that manuscript indicates that there was an unknown governor at that time, at 5 or 6 BC. And that was a certain governor later on who had ruled twice. So that could quite possibly have been Quirinius at that time. And at that time, he could quite possibly have had a census as well, an earlier census. Not the great census, which Luke also knew about, and we can read about that. We've already studied that in Acts 5. We knew that there was already a great census. Luke knew about that. But he's talking about a different census, an earlier census that probably came out. Just like in Canada, we have censuses. This year, we had a long census. 5 years earlier, we had a short census. I suspect that's what they had way back then as well. So, that first census may quite well have preceded the great census of Quirinius by a dozen years. It could quite well have been a trial run of the bigger and better census for taxation purposes. Much like we had a short form census 5 years ago, which preceded this year's long form census in Canada, a census that had over 98% compliance due to severe penalties for non-compliance. So that's why Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem, because they knew there was penalties if they didn't. Now, just incidentally, you're thinking, wait a minute, AD and BC. Jesus was born in 1 AD or something weird like that. No, as we mentioned, it was 5 or 6 BC. Well, that doesn't make sense with the AD. Anno Domini. Oh, wait a minute. This was an approximation made in the 6th century. He just sort of thought, okay, Jesus might have been born around then. Might have been AD then at one point. And he wasn't too bad. He was 6 centuries removed, so he's only out by 1%. No big deal. He was close enough. 5 or 6 BC, making that guess 6 centuries later, it's a good guess. So being out 1% doesn't make a big difference. And put a little joke in there, unless, of course, a 1% longer pregnancy would matter. Now, as regards to the coming out of Jesus to Jerusalem a mere 8 days later, you're thinking, oh, wait a minute, that's a long trip to go to Jerusalem 8 days later. Mommy's going to be pretty fatigued 8 days later after he was born. But Jerusalem wasn't that far from Bethlehem. Wasn't that far at all. 10 clicks at the most. And if she was riding a mule, it wasn't a big journey at all. So it was an easy one-day ride on a mule for a non-sleep deprived Mary. How do we know she was not sleep deprived? Because no crying he makes. Y'all know that song. No crying he makes. Dun, 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 dun. Anyways, now, There is a difficult word in the better manuscripts that suggests that they had to be purified in the temple in Jerusalem. They. Whoa, what do you mean they had to be purified? It means more than one, right? What, did Jesus have to be purified in the temple? Hardly. That would be a horrible, horrible idea. How would the Son of God have to be purified? That's ridiculous. However, I would submit that only Mary had to be purified. That she had to be purified before she could be truly married, before Joseph could have pure intercourse with her. That's the rules from Leviticus.